Greetings and welcome to the Recombobulation Area. My name is Dan Schaefer. Thank you for joining us. We are recording this on April 8th, 2026, and that means we just wrapped up the spring election here in Wisconsin. There's a whole lot to recombobulate on as we dig through the results from races from across the state, but the big headline is from the statewide race for Wisconsin Supreme Court, where Chris Taylor delivered a resounding landslide victory over Maria Lazar, winning by an astonishing 20-point margin. Not only does this mean a 10-year term on the state's highest court for Taylor, but it means the court will remain in liberal control through at least 2030. There's a lot to discuss with this race and with the big picture for the Wisconsin Supreme Court and what it means for state politics, and we're excited to be joined by someone who knows these state Supreme Court races well, Sachin Chheda, who led or co-led 6 campaigns for Wisconsin Supreme Court, including 3 races to help win this majority with Justices Dallet, Karofsky, and Protasiewicz. He's also a progressive strategist based in Milwaukee, a former senior aide to Governor Jim Doyle, and he's worked on campaigns for Tammy Baldwin and Milwaukee Mayor Cavalier Johnson, along with a host of local candidates and progressive causes across Wisconsin. Sachin, welcome to the Recombobulation Area.
Dan, so glad to be here and glad to be in the Recombobulation Area and not have to be in an airport, although I am in a hotel room.
Well, we love a little airplane humor here at the Recombobulation Area, of course. So, we'll have an opportunity to recombobulate sooner than later. But you had a pretty remarkable night last night, and you were, I understand, at the victory party for Judge Chris Taylor. So, tell me about how last night was for all of you there.
Yeah, look, it was a super fun night. I want to be clear. I didn't work on Judge Taylor's race. I'm a supporter. Tried to be as helpful to them as I could, and have worked with some of the other members of the progressive majority who obviously were really involved in the campaign, and I helped to coordinate some of their time. But the campaign team, campaign manager Ashley Franz, the candidate, obviously, Chris Taylor, strategist Scott Spector, so many other people on the team, Sam Recker, who just did a fantastic job. And part of this is that I think in a lot of places, we were just talking about this before we started, the candidate themselves and their teams don't get enough credit, right? And I think that it's obviously there's some externalities, right? There's a political environment in which we're living, but that does not explain all of a 20-point win, right? It is a candidate who is delivering message, who is giving voters confidence that they can do the job, that is bringing their experience and their values to bear, and their understanding of the role of a judge and in our system. And I think Chris Taylor deserves a tremendous amount of credit in how she told her story and how she inspired supporters and volunteers and donors and all the people who have to make a campaign successful.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. I really, I've been to a bunch of these kind of get to know the candidate events that Marquette University has held for these various state Supreme Court races over the past few years. I was there, last year they had one with Susan Crawford and with Brad Schimmel. This year they had it with Maria Lazar and Chris Taylor. And, at that event, it's an hour-long sit-down with Derek Mosley. You kind of cover a lot of ground about the person's career and about, their message in the campaign and the top issues that really stand out. And I thought Taylor was terrific in that. And I thought she really stood out from so many of the other candidates that I've seen in those types of settings. She was somebody who was clear on her values and motivations. She drew a stark but respectful contrast with her opponent, demonstrated this forward-looking vision for the court. I really liked how she talked about how she wanted the court to hear more cases and really, start to get moving and a little bit more with this liberal majority. I thought it was a home run performance in that setting, and she proved herself to be a home run candidate. And I mean, a 20-point margin in these races in a state like Wisconsin in general, but even though Democrats and liberal aligned candidates, or however you want to characterize it, have had this winning streak over the past few years, this is really the exclamation point. A 20-point win is really remarkable. Did you have any expectations that it would be to that level when you were, getting together with folks last night?
Well, I'm going to answer that question. Let me say something. Maria Lazar has made a big issue, did make a big issue, say we didn't debate enough. And I'm just going to tell you, that helped Maria Lazar. If Maria Lazar had spend more time on a stage with Chris Taylor, that would have helped Chris Taylor more. Like it's just astonishing that she believes that she won the debate that they had, which did not happen, or that comparison works in her favor. The number of times she just got the law wrong and could not explain the issues that the Supreme Court confronts. It was really astonishing to me, right? My sometimes I think, I don't agree with these judges or judge candidates and their perspective, but I respect their work and their intelligence. And Maria did not strike me as a very strong judge. She kept explaining cases in ways that were just simply wrong. And that's why I think she got overturned so many times, including by conservatives at the Supreme Court. Just to answer your question, I think, look, I thought it was going to be more than 11, right? 11 is the number that these four other winners hit or really close to it, right? They were all about 11. I was saying I thought it was going to be like 15. I also thought turnout was going to be significantly lower than it was, just based on the amount of spending and the amount of energy, et cetera. So turnout was a lot higher than I expected, maybe 40% higher than I expected it to be. And obviously the margin was, a third higher than I thought it was going to be. So huge win. And, look, across the country, there is a reaction to the insanity of the Trump administration. Even in that race, the congressional race that Democrats lost in Georgia, the overperformance was very significant. I think that candidate in Marjorie Taylor Greene's district only lost by about 10 points or 11 points. And, that's a seat that, I'm guessing is a 30-point Republican district. And so you have this situation where people really are confronted with a national environment where the economy and war, I keep saying war, famine, and pestilence, this idea that we should just create chaos all the time. I understand why people wanted change and why they wanted some disruption to the status quo. But even a lot of conservative voters do not like what we're seeing today in the world, and they're not showing up for right-wing candidates.
Yeah, it is. It's all of those factors, right? It's the realignment that we're seeing in our politics. It's the turnout. It's the reaction to what's happening nationally. I mean, the news that was happening nationally yesterday was just so bonkers with the post that Trump put out in the morning. And I was thinking just like, there's not a lot that people can do in their own lives to react to this. But like, here's one small part in this story that you can play by going to the polls and voting for a justice who would be a check on Trump. And that's one of the points that I made in my piece, too, is that, Wisconsin voters have elected Trump twice. So he's obviously has some level of popularity here. But, perhaps more than a legislative one, it's the judicial one that voters want to see a check on Trump. They might agree with, what's going on, what Republicans are advancing as an agenda or whatever it might be, but want that judicial check on Trump. And I think you look no further than the 2020 case to overturn the election results, which, as you mentioned, Maria Lazar in that debate, I thought that was one of the worst moments for her in the debate. She just was just a bumbling mess when that case came up in that debate. And now the three conservative justices or right-wing justices, I don't think you can call somebody conservative if they're voting to overturn a free and fair election. All three of those justices are going to be gone from the court by next year. And no right-wing justice will have won any of these races since 2020. It's been 4-0 for these liberal candidates since then. And so I think there is a sense of this that is, part of this is being a check on Trump from the judicial branch.
Yeah, I mean, look, I'm not sure that I would always say a check on Trump. I mean, they want us to uphold the rule of law, and that's not any different than a ton of Trump-appointed judges in the federal system who have done that. Maybe not as much as we would have liked, and definitely not enough on the U.S. Supreme Court. But I think people want the rule of law to be upheld, right? And I think they want a system that is stable, and I think they want a system that is rational. And they want people to make decisions, and not just be chaotic. And look, I think some of Trump is chaos, and some of it is intentional manipulation of markets to make money for him and his friends. I think it's both of those things. But the consequences to real people are real, right? Gas prices are up. Unemployment is going to go up. We are seeing chaos in the economy. We did see 1 million people die in the COVID pandemic under Trump's leadership because he did not get in front of this and lead our country in the way that he needed. These are real consequences. What we're seeing obviously in Iran, I literally had to have a conversation yesterday about like what would happen if an hour before the polls closed, Trump dropped a nuclear bomb somewhere in the Middle East. Like that wasn't a like crazy conversation to have. That was a rational response to what was happening in the world that we have to consider. How will that impact this election? How will that impact the election night events? How will that impact the speeches? How will that impact the celebration? How will that impact people's lives? Obviously, right? I can't believe we're even having these conversations, right? It's really too bad because I think people in general, I don't even think that's what most Trump voters wanted. I don't think that's what the people of America want. I don't think that's what the people of the world want. People want to take care of their families and, live their lives, go to their jobs, go on vacation, take care of their kids, right? I'm going to go watch my kid play soccer on a suburban soccer field all weekend in another state because like people want to live their normal lives, right? Under Trump's leadership, we just get less of that. Right. And so it's not that like people, I don't even think it's a partisan choice. Right. It's not that they're electing a judge to say, stop Donald Trump. They're like, we want rationality in the system. We want stability. Yeah. We want normalcy. And to your example, right, if Maria Lazar can't stand up years later and say, yeah, I definitely would not have voted to overturn that election on spurious nonsense grounds. Yeah, that's a problem. Right. Like they're lost. They are lost. And until the Republican Party figures out that it's lost, the Democrats are going to continue to have, on average, more success in Wisconsin elections.
Yeah. And I think, there is obviously that piece of it, but I think that alone would not explain a 20-point margin either.
Of
right?
Course. No one thing can, right? Yeah. No, it's all of those things. And again, I would point back to Chris Taylor ran a fantastic campaign. She did a great job as a candidate. Her team did a great job. And that laid the groundwork. People say there was a spending disparity. Yeah, because a good campaign goes and raises money. Like that's what good campaigns do, right? So if Maria Lazar didn't raise as much money, under rules that Scott Walker wrote, and Scott Walker's son apparently ran that campaign, like it's their rules. If they can't run a winning campaign, don't complain about the rules. Don't complain about what your opponent did. Go do the work, right? Make the phone calls, organize the people, inspire voters, inspire volunteers. And the Lazar campaign didn't do any of that. And I think that's why they got killed.
Absolutely. And I also think that, there was a tweet from the former governor going around today who's just saying it credits the entire loss to just money. Say just that it just comes down to money. Well, if it just came down to money, then Elon Musk's astronomical spending and the independent expenditures that were coming in to back Brad Schimmel in the race last year, that if it was just about money, then Brad Schimmel would have won. Full stop. I mean, right?
Exactly what my response was to that message. Part of it is like we live in a media environment, and I think this is how Trump operates, right? And all of his acolytes, like Scott Walker, which is, there's never any context and there's never any history. We're just going to say a thing in a moment and pretend that everything that happened before didn't happen, because we just are never accountable for that, because the media environment is such that we're always pushing forward. There's always more content. There's always more information, and we're always pushing forward, and providing context is boring, right? So the fact that Scott Walker himself changed the rules in Wisconsin to allow this massive increase in money, right? Unlimited contributions to campaigns from political parties, unlimited contributions to political parties. The Democrats were against that. They voted against that. Scott Walker and his allies in the legislature pushed that through. Now it's biting them in the butt because our side is organizing better in the environment that we live in. So take some ownership, right? Mm-hmm. If Scott Walker stood up and said, I made a mistake in 2015 or whatever it was, maybe I'd have an iota of respect, right? But they haven't earned any because it's nonsense.
And with the Republican-controlled legislature, they could have addressed this. They could have tried to work with Tony Evers to be like, hey, you know what? This is out of control. This isn't working for anybody. Democrats have often said, like I remember talking to Ben Wickler last year after Susan Crawford won, and it just said, would you support, changing the camp finance laws to close this loophole? And he was like, absolutely. Let's do it tomorrow.
There's no doubt.
You know?
It's exactly what they did with the maps, right? They put Tony
Yeah.
Evers' maps in front of him from the maps he'd introduced in the case, and he had to sign them, right? If Republicans proposed a bill to close unlimited contribution loopholes, the vast majority of Democrats, if not 100% of them, would vote for that. They would have to. That's
Absolutely.
our values. I don't believe
Absolutely.
in unlimited contributions to political parties. I don't believe in unlimited contributions from political parties to campaigns. It is corrupt. It is bad. Now, that's the system we live in, so that's the system we're going to use, right? And frankly, in an environment where Citizens United exists, like at least those contributions are reported, unlike a lot of the independent, federal and national dark money. But I do think that if they believed in the things that they claim to believe in, we could have a better system and we could have a less corrupt system. But they don't want that, right? They just want to win. And now they can't or don't know how to in this system. I mean, the other thing I said today, their views are unpopular, right? So like some people are saying it's just abortion, abortion, abortion. Yes, your position on abortion is not supported by the vast majority of people in America, right? 7 in 10 people in America support the construct of Roe v. Wade and access to abortion care for women in America, right? So if you constantly say that's not our position, that's going to hurt you. Don't whine about it. Don't complain about it. You have a minority position, and it's a small minority, right? Now, if they were able to convince people on whatever taxes or whatever, maybe we'd be having a different conversation. But they keep doing awful things that the American people don't support, and then there are consequences to that. That's what happens.
Absolutely. I also think a part of this, that we're examining in these results that drove this 20-point victory, I think a big part of this is the realignment that we're seeing in our politics that I think has been, happening throughout the Trump era, and I think has really become turbocharged in what we're seeing in the results last night. Because I think you had this situation where in 2024, when Trump won in Wisconsin, the narrowest margin of victory of any of the swing states that he won, he did much better with these lower propensity voters, these folks who don't show up in every election. And I think it used to be that those lower propensity voters were more likely to be Democratic voters, particularly with Obama. Obama did great with driving turnout with lower propensity voters. Trump has also done very well with that. But the trade-off is that some of the voters who show up every election, every primary, every school board race, every local election, every midterm, every spring election, every state Supreme Court race, those voters are much more likely to be Democratic voters now than they were, say, 15 years ago.
Absolutely.
To what extent?
I don't have anything to add to that. You're right.
To what extent do you think that is continuing to unfold? And do you think that realignment is going to accelerate perhaps in the months ahead here in Wisconsin as we look to the midterms?
So I may have a little bit of an unconventional view on this because I think candidates and campaigns and environment matter a lot more than people give them credit for. So I think, sure, there are some trends and there's some correlation and maybe there's even some causation there around, the more educated, wealthier, especially suburban voter, kind of turning away from Trump and being turned off by Trump's style, especially, right? Let alone the substance that we're seeing these days, right? But I also think, look, he also won in 2024 in Wisconsin, right? And was able to turn out some of those lower propensity voters and hold on to a bunch of Republican voters who were upset about Joe Biden. And so I think that each election happens in the moment of what's happening in the world and how people's lives are affected. If the economy is down the tubes, people are going to vote against incumbents. If people are unhappy, they're going to vote against incumbents of either party, right? If they want change, if they like how things are going, they're more likely to support incumbents, right? And we haven't had a ton of those elections in my adult life, but like 1996 would be a great example, right? Where like the budget was on its way to balance and was balanced, peace in the world, there was a peace dividend, right? We were cutting the military budget. The economy was roaring, right? There were a lot of things happening. And so Bill Clinton was like, don't rock the boat, change how things are going, right? Obama in 2012 was a little bit of that, right? Where things were really looking up, things had changed, right? Obviously, for the last few elections, so at the presidential level, it's flipped, right? It's flipped a bunch of times in a row because people are still unhappy. They're still unhappy with the state of the world, the state of the economy, people's ability to get ahead, plan for retirement, buy a house. My kids, my adult kids, my oldest says this to me like once a week, right? How am I going to buy a house? How am I going to buy a house, right? Now, he's a pretty consistent voter on the left and has more progressive views than me on a lot of things. But that's the driver of like how he experiences life, right? As a union worker in a factory, which is what he does. And so that's the problem that the economy has, and frankly, Democrats haven't solved either, right? That like we have to propose the solutions that are going to, today it's like it's an affordability crisis. So we're going to have like these like this campaign, but it's a much more sustained problem in how we've built our economy. What I would say is, our economy is very weighted towards the success of billionaires. And I think the analysis of the problem is correct, kind of from the Bernie wing, AOC wing of our party. I'm not sure they always propose the right solutions to that. I think that we need to find some more broadly based solutions that are not just, socialism, but some of the things from socialism are great. Some of the things from capitalism are great. We need to build an agenda it's going to build the economy that we want to build, right? And I don't think any one person or any one politician especially has the answer to that. But the alignment thing then can change, right? Like that. So I think there are trend lines, but I think what's most important is, look, we're going to win in 2026. I think the left is going to win big in 2026 because it's a reaction to Trump. But how do you sustain that to 2028 and to 2030? I have a lot of worries about that, right? Because if we just ride defense to a win, reaction to Trump to a win, that's not going to get us where we need to get to. And we want to sustain some of these gains and sustain some of the success in terms of building the country and the world that we want to live in, right? So,
right.
Anyway,
it can't just be
ramble, but
no, you're right. It can't just be about the sugar rush of, hey, the polls are in our favor this time. Let's just lean into that and figure the rest out later. It has to be part of a more cohesive, longer term strategy that I think, especially for Democrats, you've got to build that big tent. You've got to make room for so many more people to be part of the party and not push people out too.
Can I give you an example of that, Dan, in
Sure.
today's politics that I think it's gonna continue to rise as an issue? So data centers are a great example of this. Data centers are not a partisan issue, right? There are rural communities that are like, I don't want a data center in my backyard. There are urban communities that are like, my bills are going up. Rural people, bills are going up. There are lots of people in the Democratic coalition who are like, let's build, local elected officials who want tax base, or labor unions who want to build things. Like, let's build. There's a huge problem with energy cost, right? And is our grid going to be able to sustain? And are we going to be able to? So there's all these issues, and they don't start, middle, or end in partisan ways. The party that picks up an agenda that responds to this smartly and moves the ball forward, that's the one that's going to be successful. And right now, both parties have a piece of that. Tom Tiffany has a great message for him on the price of electricity. He has a terrible message on the driver of that. He thinks it's renewables, which is like absolutely false. Renewables actually reduce the cost of energy. The left is like, hey, we need to address utility bills. We need to make sure that highly paid workers build these data centers, but they're not being as responsive to, like, not all of them at least, being as responsive to like the concerns in the communities of the economy that we're building, the communities that we're building, taking up farmland. So there's got to be some like bringing together of the concerns that people have. Some of that is populist. Some of that is like sustaining a middle-class economy, and nobody's done it yet. Right. I would argue, I love the Democrats. I'm against the Republican. I'm a partisan, but I will say nobody's done this yet on this issue. And there's a lot of open space for people to figure it out. And there's like all these bills that have been proposed, and like some of the provisions in the Republican bills are good. Some of them are terrible. Same thing with the Democratic bills. How do you put it together in a way that says, here's an agenda that's going to drive Wisconsin forward, that's going to drive America forward? That's what has to happen this fall. And then all of that fallout is going to come to like, how do Supreme Courts or other types of local officials respond to those threats, right? So you saw this thing in Port Washington where,
I was going to mention that.
I think it was 2/3 of the vote were like, please don't do that to us again. We can't stop this one, but you can't just like make these policy decisions in these vacuums the way that the Port Washington local elected officials did. I understand why they did it. They wanted tax base, right? That's what they wanted, so they could fund their streets and their schools and all the whatever they're funding, right? Their streetlights. But there's a huge consequence to that, because there's this massive $1 billion building that is totally out of character with the community that they're building it in, right? And there's a huge concern about water and energy and cost. So how do you confront that? There's a lot that's going to happen in the next 5, 10, 20 years. And that's where the realignment is going to come down, right? Is that it's not just like, higher educated voters and lower educated voters and higher income voters and lower income voters. It's like, who's going to be responsive to the challenges that America faces in the economy and in our communities and in our society over the course of the next decade or two?
Absolutely. So before we look forward a little bit more, I want to look back too, because you were part of a number of the victories that for the Wisconsin Supreme Court. Like I mentioned, you were part of the races for Justices Dallet in 2018, Karofsky in 2020, and Protasiewicz in 2023. So take me back to a year before that Dallet race in 2017, when current Justice Annette Ziegler, whose term is up next year, she said she will not be seeking another 10-year term on the court. She ran basically unopposed in that race.
She ran unopposed, not basically unopposed. She ran unopposed.
She ran unopposed.
On the ballot. Yep.
That was kind of the peak of discombobulation for Wisconsin Democrats after Trump winning in the fall, Ziegler winning in the spring. But from there, things have really changed. So how did that get started?
Well, look, I think that, again, candidates learned lessons and campaign people learned lessons. I worked on 2 Supreme Court races before that, both of which were losses. The narrow loss in 2008 with Louis Butler against Michael Gableman, where we couldn't overcome kind of the racist ad and, the big money, all those kinds of things. 20,000 vote loss statewide. Very, 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 very close race. And then I was part of a race in 2015. My candidate actually didn't even get through the primary, got like less than 15% of the vote because there was a right candidate and a left candidate, and my candidate was a little bit more in the middle. And then the Dems ended up losing that race. But they, the progressives didn't win, had never won a non-incumbent race for Supreme Court, maybe since the progressive era of Wisconsin politics 100 years earlier until 2018. And I think the choice that Justice Dallet made was that she recognized at that political moment that we had to do things differently, right? And I ran that race, but she was the candidate driving the train. And she said, we have to be clear with people about what the stakes are. That's what she said. And so in our messaging, in her performance, in the ads, all of those things, we put the issues to people in a much less coded way. It was still coded, but it was a much less coded way, right? The example that I'd offer is that there was an ad in that race where there was a Donald Trump ad on a TV in the ad, right? So you watched the ad and you saw Donald Trump, and it was designed to trigger that response, right? Because that was what was at stake in the spring of 2018. We were a little bit over a year into Donald Trump's first term as president. Obviously, I'd even go for what his first term was compared to what we have today. But
seriously,
whatever that, it seemed really bad at the time. And so that resulted in laying out the stakes for voters in a very different way, right? We laid out the stakes for voters in a different way, and they made a choice. The voters made a choice. She won by 11 points, right? Still relatively low turnout, 1.1 million people statewide. I remember looking at, we were in this tiny little control room of this little bar that the party was in. We didn't have these big hotel room parties yet, right? We were in this tiny little, it was like me and her husband and maybe 1 or 2 other people. And we're looking at the results, on a phone or a computer. And we started winning those counties in the Fox Valley by pretty big margins. And that was when we realized that we'd won. And, it wasn't $100 million. It was, I think we spent a couple $1 million, right? It was a much, much lower stakes race. But the messaging was really different. And what I would say is that it took a couple cycles for those lessons to bake in, but it's very clear now that what candidates for this office need to do is explain to the people what is at stake. It goes back to what you were talking about at the top of the podcast, right? Which is these issues affect real people, whether it is corporate control of the economy, or it is abortion, or it is our legislative district maps, or it is the rules of our economy, or whatever it is. And by and large, the more educated a voter is, they're like, hey, it's pretty clear what side of that we want to be on, right? And so that trend line has kind of stayed consistent, 2020, 2023, 2025, and now 2026. And I think that's how the Dems have built this majority. And Justice Dallet, who's going to be up again in 2 years in 2028, is the one who kind of started that trend. And moved us in that direction. I would also say that, in that year, the Democratic Party wasn't involved in the race, really, because it was still under the old leadership. But after Wickler got elected, I think in 2017, let me try to do the math here. I can't remember what year he got elected.
I think it was 19. I think he was 19.
Was he post Evers? I can't remember that. So anyway, when he got elected, then in 2020, the party was actually directly engaged, right, in a way that was different and really taking advantage of those rules that Scott Walker had written. And then that changed the mechanics as well, right? And so we were able to win in crazy times, COVID times, the pandemic election. I think we had 10 or 15 polling places in the entire city of Milwaukee at the last second, right?
It was 5.
Unclear whether the election was going to take place, right?
Right.
In the 3 days before the election got canceled and put back on, and all that craziness. And so I think those are the lessons. And then with Janet, she was very clear about what the stakes of the election are, right? Very, very clear about it. Janet Protasiewicz, and then Susan Crawford continued that. Chris Taylor's continued that. And the people are making a clear choice, right? They're making an informed decision about that value set, about rule of law and stability in the system, and not wanting corporate and right-wing interests to have captured the court the way that it had been for a decade or two prior to that.
Mm-hmm. So you feel like Dallet's campaign really set the template for this winning streak that's come, because it's 5 of the last 6.
Yeah, I mean, look,
with Hagedorn's very small victory.
Yeah, I don't want to say that self-aggrandizing. I can't even say that word, self-aggrandizingly, because I was running the campaign. But look, I think that's the math, right? We didn't win in the few races before that, right? Going back to 2000, the incumbents won. Shirley Abramson and Ann Walsh Bradley. But look, Shirley Abramson was initially appointed, and then I was in the 70s, so she was there a long time. Ann Walsh Bradley, who I think did turn out to be the conscience of the court, as was said last night, and a progressive, was not elected initially as a progressive. The Republican incumbent first lady of the state was the co-chair of her campaign in 1995. She was very much seen as a moderate at that time, and the she was seen as Tommy Thompson's candidate because Sue Ann Thompson was her campaign co-chair, right? And obviously that's not the kind of, she ended up being a more progressive judge than that. But, a non-incumbent progressive had not won that I know of in my lifetime until 2018.
So what were some of the lessons that really stood out along the way with these? Was it, because I remember being at this WIS Politics forum in 2023 when there was 4 candidates. It was Protasiewicz, Everett Mitchell, Jennifer Doro, and Dan Kelly. And at that forum, there was a question about redistricting, an issue I care very deeply about, that came up, and Protasiewicz just went out and said it. The maps are rigged.
I mean, she told the truth. And let me just be clear. At that moment in time, and even today, a federal court has ruled, like this is undisputed, a federal court ruled that the legislative district maps in Wisconsin were rigged. And that's never been overturned. Like, that ruling stands. There was a standing question, but the substantive decision has never been refuted. And so when Maria Lazar in this race said, well, I don't believe that. Okay, well, you just don't believe a fact. Like, that is a mathematical fact. And a court actually decided that that was true based on hearing evidence and cross-examination. I was in the trial. I was in the room when they were cross-examining the witnesses. And the judges in that federal case said these maps are rigged. Right, that's what happened. So I think what Janet is really good at, what Justice Protasiewicz is really good at, I've known her for a long time, is she's a truth teller, and she's kind of no bones about it, and she always has been. In fact, the very first time she ran for judge, I was not working for her. I was working for another candidate, and she got in the race, and she said, "Here's what I think." And I looked at my candidate, and I was like, "We're literally not going to get through the primary because it's going to be her," and it was Rebecca Bradley was the Republican, right? A bunch of independent money came in at the end. Janet actually lost that race for circuit court, but then ran again in the fall for a different seat and won, I think, unopposed. And then, obviously the kind of rest is history. But I think, people have to tell the truth. And I think Chris Taylor did that in this campaign really well. very directly, wasn't afraid of a single criticism that Maria Lazar offered, wasn't afraid to talk about any of the things, said, here's the things I can talk about, here's the things I can't talk about, right? But like, there was this accusation, well, you're a Democrat. And she's like, yeah, I served in the legislature as a Democrat. Like, why am I supposed to hide that? Like, this is a thing that happened. But their Republican speaker also served on the court. Like, this is a thing that happens. And do any Republicans say that David Prosser wasn't a fair, independent judge, right? Like, the hypocrisy is astounding, right? Tell the truth, right? Just go out there and say who you are and what you stand for. Don't pre-decide cases. I think they're very careful about that. But
yes,
facts can be facts, and they say that, and that's super helpful for voters to understand who they are. All of the kind of talking in circles that Dan Kelly did or Maria Lazar did, it doesn't serve to inform voters, right? You got to say what you're for. Now, their problem is they could say what they're for, and it's not popular with voters, right?
There is that. There is that.
And so that's the problem that they have. And they don't have a solution to that right now, which is why who knows what's even going to happen if they're even going to have a candidate in 2027.
Well, and I think what you're speaking to is something that Marquette started polling on this too, of just like, do you want your judicial candidates to say what they want, say what they believe in, say what their values are, say what their positions are on a variety of issues? And the overwhelming majority, I don't have the numbers in front of me, but I want to say it's like 75% of voters want to hear what these candidates have to say. And I think, being that it is this like nonpartisan race and you have to dance around specific cases and just like every, answer to every question has to be prefaced with saying, oh, I wouldn't know until the facts are in front of me, and do that whole dance. But I think voters do really want to hear what these candidates have to say. And I think, you and others who have been part of these campaigns, the candidates in particular, making the decision to just be like, this is what I believe in. These are what my values are. These are the truths that I agree with about, things like gerrymandering or whatever it might be. I think that has been remarkably effective. And I think if Republicans are going to respond to that, because I'm seeing some of the chattering class on the right saying, hey, we need to change with the times. We need to do things differently. Even if they did, like you suggested, their views on so many of these positions that are relevant to these races are wildly out of step with the electorate.
Yeah, I mean, look, I think Schimmel did that, right? Like, Schimmel was better at it than these other ones. And all of them have stood in front of Trump signs and at Republican Party events. And, like, it's pretty clear what side they're on.
Yeah.
Chris Taylor was just extraordinarily good at this in the debate, right? I mean, the whole campaign. But every time she got a question like that, right, it was that preface. Look, if you're talking about, because, Matt and Jaron wanted them to talk about cases that were pending. And she'd be like, I can't talk about a case that's pending, but let me tell you what my values were. Like, she kept saying that over and over again.
Yeah.
And that is, let's be clear, that is what voters want. We are a small d democracy. All the nuttos will say, we're a constitutional republic. Yes, that's a kind of democracy. Google it, right? And we're a democracy. The people hold supreme. I believe in that. I believe in we the people. First words of the Declaration of Independence, right? And I think that that's what people should do. That is what candidates should do. It's obviously easier if you're running for governor or the legislature or the school board, because you can just say it. And we do want our judges to be open-minded until the cases are in front of them. And look, let me just tell you, it's not like this progressive majority always just rules with what the progressives want. I can issue case after case after case where they haven't done that because they're following the law, right? And Chris Taylor can do that in her record over and over and over again, which is why she's never been overturned. Maria Lazar's problem in this campaign is she actually was a pretty partisan judge, right? Like, and so she would even get overturned with the votes of conservatives on the Supreme Court because she wasn't even following the law because she was so partisan, right? Again, all this stuff becomes clearer to voters. They may not understand every little specific detail of the law, but they understand the vibe and they understand where people are coming from. So candidates have to present themselves in a certain way. And, we don't want to be lectured to by candidates. We want candidates to feel our pain, to have empathy, to understand the struggles that we're going through. Chris Taylor was phenomenal at doing that, has always been phenomenal at doing that as an elected official, as a community leader. And she did a great job of that in this campaign.
Mm-hmm. So before I let you go, I want to throw a hypothetical at you, if you've got the time.
Sure.
So Annette Ziegler said she is not running for re-election next year. If you were running the Republican or conservative race for that, for whatever candidate might be running to fill that seat, how would you approach that campaign?
I would tie myself to Brian Hagedorn. which is counterintuitive because there are conservatives, MAGA people who don't like him because he voted against them on overturning the election, right? Like it just comes down to that, right? And Trump was mad about it and attacked his family and all, right? So suddenly he's not a conservative. But Brian Hagedorn is a principled conservative, I think. I don't always agree with him because I'm not a conservative, right? I'm not a right winger, but he is more consistent than the other two incumbent conservative or right wing justices, right? He's more consistent than they are, and I think he also won, right? Like he won,
right?
So it is actually hilarious to me that he's the one they keep at arm's length when he's the only one that's won in the Trump era. Like, just think about the nonsense that is if you are a Republican, right? There's one guy who's been successful. Let's completely separate ourselves from him as much as we can. So you want free advice, Brian Schimming, my old friend Brian Schimming, or Matt Walker, or whoever else, tie yourself to Brian Hagedorn. I still think they're going to lose in 2027. I think there's two candidates talking very clearly about running on the progressive side. I don't know which one of them gets through. If there's a jungle primary, there's a world in which both of them get through. But I think that so I don't think the conservatives, the right wing, can win in 2027. But if you're trying to change the game, tie yourself to the guy who won. It would be the argument I'd make.
Makes sense to me. Well, Sachin, thank you so much for taking some time here for us at the Recombobulation area. Any other big picture thoughts before I let you go?
Appreciate doing this. Thanks so much for being a voice in the community and building this independent media, Dan. It's so important. You've done it as a writer. You're doing it as a podcaster. You're doing video content. You're doing it in so many different settings. What Recombobulation area is doing is important. What civic media is doing is so important. And I look forward to doing this more frequently with you if you want. So have a great day.
Sounds great to me. And before we wrap up here, I just want to remind our listeners that we're hosting an event next week on Milwaukee Day. We're hosting a live podcast at Anodyne Coffee's Walker's Point Roastery. I will be there. Angela Lang from Block will be there. Matt Wild from Milwaukee Record will be there. We'll have a few other special guests joining us at that event as well. So be sure to attend that one. I am also going to be the special guest this weekend at Laughing Liberally Milwaukee's monthly event at Comedy Sports. So come check that out on Saturday night. So we've got that on Saturday. We've got the live podcast on Tuesday. And also on Tuesday, we have our biggest subscription sale of the year at the Recombobulation area, where all subscriptions will be 41.4% off as we celebrate the 414 in the city we call home. Once more, Sachin, thank you so much for joining us here at the Recombobulation area.
Thanks. Awesome.
Thanks. Be well.